Atlantic Ocean, 1987. A brutal storm raged over the endless sea when the U.S. Coast Guard received an SOS signal. The coordinates pointed to a remote section of the ocean where no known vessels were supposed to be. The distress signal came from the SS Blackwater, a ship that had vanished mysteriously 20 years ago. Captain Jack Thompson, his first officer Mark Davis, and their rescue team prepared for what they assumed was a wreck or a ghost signal. But as their patrol boat neared the location, a massive ship emerged from the thick fog. It was Blackwater, intact, abandoned, and waiting. Jack's team cautiously climbed aboard. The ship's deck was eerily silent except for the rhythmic creaking of rusted metal. The thick air smelled of mildew and decay. Inside, they found everything untouched. Plates still had food, journals lay open, and the captain's quarters had a cup of coffee that had long dried into dust.
But there was no sign of the crew. As they moved deeper into the ship, the radio on Jack's belt crackled to life. "Leave now, before it's too late." The voice was faint, but it was clear. It was the voice of Captain Henry Adams, the captain of the Blackwater, the man who had disappeared decades ago. In the captain's cabin, Jack found an old, leather-bound logbook. The last entries were chilling. "We answered a distress call from an abandoned lifeboat. Since then, strange things have been happening. My men are disappearing one by one. We are being watched." The final page had just 4 words, scratched into the paper so hard the pen had ripped through. "IT won't let us leave." As Jack read, Mark screamed from the hallway. The team rushed out to find him staring at a rotting figure. It was a crew member. His body was decomposed, but his eyes were open and moving. Then he whispered, "You should not be here." Before anyone could react, the corpse collapsed into dust. From that moment, everything spiraled into madness. Doors closed on their own. Shadows moved unnaturally. The air turned freezing cold. Their flashlights flickered as whispers filled the halls. "They took us. They will take you too." A crew member, Chris, started convulsing. His eyes rolled back, and in a deep and natural voice, he muttered, "He is awake now." Then, he vanished into the shadows. Chris was never seen again. They tried to return to their rescue boat, but the ship had changed. The corridors twisted into an endless maze. Every turn led them back to where they started. They were trapped. Then came the shadows. Figures, barely human, slithered along the walls like living ink. They whispered in languages that hadn't been spoken for centuries. Mark felt something grab his arm. He turned and saw his own reflection staring at him, but it wasn't moving like he was. It smiled. Then it spoke in his own voice. "You will stay here." Jack suddenly remembered the original distress signal, the one that led Blackwater to its doom. He found an old, rusted radio in the communication room. Desperately, he twisted the dials, trying to send a new SOS.static. Then, a faint voice broke through. "You cannot escape. The ship does not allow it." The voice belonged to Captain Adams. Jack's heart pounded as Adams spoke again. "You must destroy the ship." Jack and his remaining men made their way to the engine room. Their plan? To set the ship on fire. But the shadows were waiting. One by one, the remaining crew were dragged into the darkness. Their screams echoed, but their bodies were never seen again. Jack was the last one standing. He reached for his flare gun as the shadows swarmed toward him. "You cannot kill what is already dead," a voice hissed. Jack fired. The flare hit the engine and ignited the oil. Flames erupted. The shadows screamed in agony. The ship shook violently as if it were alive. Jack grabbed Mark, who was barely conscious, and dragged him to the lifeboat. From the safety of the rescue boat, they watched Blackwater burn. The flames raged. And then, in an instant, the ship was gone, swallowed by the sea. Jack and Mark barely made it back to the mainland. They were found adrift, exhausted, and delirious. For weeks, they couldn't speak of what they saw. Then, one night, as Jack sat alone in his apartment, his radio crackled to life. A familiar, broken voice whispered, "We are still here." His hands shook. Then he looked out his window. In the distance, through the fog, a ship's silhouette was forming. Blackwater had returned.